Climate Smart Gardening, Part 2, Adaptation, with Marin Master Gardener, Kathy Hunting. I'm Sariana. I'm the Adult Services Librarian at the San Anselmo Library. And before we begin, I'd like to thank the Friends of the Library and the Library Parcel Tax for sponsoring this program and all library programs. Our speaker today is Kathy Hunting. She's been a Marin Master Gardener since 2014. Kathy is an environmental health scientist by training, and she lives on a sunny acre in Point Grey Station, where her garden is full of tasty vegetables and fruits. She also attempts to grow ornamentals that the deer will not find as tasty. We also have Barbara Robertson joining us today. Barbara became a Master Gardener in 2015 and has turned her skills as a journalist toward writing some of the Marin Master Gardener columns in the Marin IJ. She has a shady garden in Tam Valley where she grows strawberries, potatoes, lettuce, and ferns. So everyone will remain muted until the end of the presentation. But if you have a question for Kathy, please type it into the chat box. Barbara will be monitoring the chat and will answer the questions directly in the chat, or she'll alert Kathy to any questions that should be answered live. Technology can be very fickle, and I want to thank you all in advance for your patience and understanding during this program. We are recording this program today, so if you miss anything, I'll send the recording out to everyone who registered for the program later today. Please join me in welcoming both Kathy and Barbara. Woo, yay! I'm clapping and cheering for everybody.
Hi, everybody. We are delighted to be here today. Let me just get that. There we go. Let me just get that up. I want to start by saying that Barbara and I worked together to create this presentation, this two-part presentation. Barbara was actually the primary researcher and author of this presentation, and so we kind of do this in a tag team fashion. So thank you for being here today. For those of you who don't know, who are not familiar with what Master Gardeners are, who we are and what we do, we're trained volunteers. We go through an 18-week training program to prepare us to work with the University of California Cooperative Extension to share our knowledge and skills with the public. And we focus on home horticulture, pest management, and sustainable landscape practices. And we always are focusing on presenting evidence-based information supported by research. There's a lot of anecdotal gardening information out there that you can find from everybody from your grandmother to the web, and we try to focus on information that's backed up by research. So that's us, Marin Master Gardeners. Today's focus is on adaptation to climate change in the garden. And adaptation in any context means that we make changes to suit the context and to fit a need. So in the context of climate change, what adaptation means is that we know that climate change is here, and we know it's going to get worse over time. And so we are focused on practices that we can put into place that help us understand and prepare for and counterbalance those environmental impacts of climate change. Adaptation is a partner to mitigation, and climate change mitigation means the practices that actually help us remove carbon from the atmosphere, and so help alleviate or reduce the impact of climate change. And so adaptation means that we're preparing our gardens to succeed in the environment that climate change brings us. And that's what we're going to focus on today. Before I get into adaptation, I just want to review quite quickly for those of you who weren't here 2 weeks ago when we talked about climate change impacts and climate change mitigation. And I just want to quickly review the 4 major environmental impacts of climate change that are most relevant to home gardeners. And those 4 factors are in this box on your slide. The first one is that temperatures are rising. Temperatures have already risen since the pre-industrial times. And in the next 20 years, by the middle of 30 years, by the middle of the century, we're expecting another few degrees of increasing temperature in the Bay Area. So that is a given. We're already dealing with more warmth, and there's even more warmth to come. Climate change scientists don't actually think that our average precipitation in the Bay Area is going to change very much in the next few decades. However, our climate is getting more unstable, and that instability in our climate is expressing itself through more extremes of precipitation. And so we'll have more extreme storms, atmospheric river storms that bring a ton of moisture just in a 2 or 3 day period and lead to flooding, saturated soil, all kinds of negative impacts of too much water coming down at once. On the other extreme is the situation that we're finding ourselves in right now. We're in the second year of a drought in California, following a 5-year drought earlier, from 2012 to 2016. And so with more drought years, obviously there's going to be impacts on plants from water, from lack of water, and we'll talk about that more. And going along with that, we've got, with the temperature increases, with more heat waves, more intense heat waves, longer heat waves, that combined with the precipitation extremes is certainly going to have an impact on our gardens. Our ecosystems are also changing, and that means everything from the insects that pollinate our plants may be getting out of sync with the plants. They may be getting out of sync with the beneficial insects, may be getting out of sync with the pests. And so pests in our gardens may become harder to control. And then our native habitat that lives around us is also changing, along with some of the wildlife that depends on that habitat. Finally, soil is being altered by the temperature increases and the precipitation extremes of climate change. And soil is a really complex ecosystem, and when it's faced with higher temperatures and more extremes of precipitation, that changes the ability of the soil to hold nutrients, to hold water, to support plant life, and to store carbon. And so those are the main impacts of climate change that are relevant to us as home gardeners. In the talk 2 weeks ago, we focused on the 5 areas of mitigation that are shown in the right-hand box on this slide. And if you're interested in learning more about those, the recording of the talk is in the link that Sariana sent. But for now, we're going to move on to adaptation. And you'll also find that there are times that adaptation and mitigation overlap, and I'll point out a few of those as we go. Okay, so these are the 9 areas that we're going to touch on as we think about adapting to climate change. So let's dive in. The first thing that master gardeners are taught when we are trained to help home gardeners is to think about how you assess your garden's baseline. Because if you don't know where you are to start, it's really hard to figure out where you want to go. And so understanding the characteristics of your garden, what kinds of plants do you have? How does hardscape, that is the amount of patio, of stone, of cement, of wind protection, how do those all impact what you want to do in the garden? What are your water systems? And what's the climate in your garden? What's your microclimate? And in fact, you may have several microclimates If you have a large property, especially, you may have different places in your garden that are subject to frost or that get really, really hot, or where the wind is particularly problematic. We want to understand our garden's characteristics through the seasons, throughout the whole cycle of the year. And we're so lucky here in Marin to have a 12-month growing climate. Whether you're talking about in your ornamental landscape or in your edible garden, we have plants that are growing and blooming throughout the year. Most of our plants are more dormant in the winter, but we really do have a 12-month cycle, and it's good to understand what happens throughout the seasons. One of the things that's happening with climate change, as you see in this figure up here, is that climate zones are really migrating as the climate warms. And that's in terms of temperature, that's affecting the number of days of frost that we get. And so here in the West, and this is a big average, whoops, sorry about that. This big average plus a plus of 19 additional frost-free days. And that's across the whole Southwest, including the Mountain West in Colorado. But that means that those of you who are growing things that actually need cold weather, like many varieties of fruit trees, you're going to be having less frost. For those of you who want to grow more citrus and to not have some of your succulents bite the dust in a cold, frosty winter, that's good news. So, but it's good to understand what's happening with our climate. It's also really important as part of your baseline to understand the characteristics of your soil. Do you have soil that has a lot of clay in it that holds water really well? Or do you have soil like my neighbors in Inverness, here out in West Marin, who have soil that has a high content of decomposed granite and doesn't hold water very well? The characteristics of your soil are going to influence your watering patterns and what you want to do to improve and build your soil. Although I would say compost helps both. Compost helps a clay soil, and compost helps decompose granite. So we'll talk about compost a little bit later. It's helpful to know what kind of nutrients are in your soil. You don't want to put fertilizer on the soil when your soil has plenty of nutrients already. Okay, let's move on. So speaking of soil, really in more ways than one, soil is foundational to a healthy garden. And so everything that we do to work on our soil, to improve our soil and protect it from erosion and from compaction, is going to help us adapt to climate change. And let me just explain what the things are that we can do to improve the soil and protect the soil and how that helps us with climate change. One of our mantras is compost, compost, compost. Compost is a very gentle soil amendment that helps build the organic content of our soil and adds very modest amounts of nutrients. As we add compost to our soil, or we put compost on the surface of the soil, it helps encourage the soil organisms, the soil life, the little tiny insects and microorganisms, and also the fungi systems that live in our soil. It helps encourage them to be very active, and that in turn supports plant life and helps keep our plants healthy. Another thing we can do, and one of the most important things with regard to climate change is the more organic matter we have in our soil, the more that soil holds water. And so we need to water less when we have really healthy, organic, rich soil. And that soil stores more carbon. It is also more healthy for growing plants. And the more plants the soil has on it, the more carbon the soil stores. So improving and protecting the soil is both an adaptation strategy and a strategy of mitigation, because soil is a carbon sink. Soil helps remove, healthy soil helps remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it in the soil with plant life, plant roots, and the whole biological community that lives under our feet. Mulching is another really important adaptive strategy for climate change, because when you have the soil surface protected by both plants and mulch, that soil is going to lose less water. And if you're using an organic mulch, and by that I don't mean organic, like organic certified, but I mean of an organic material like wood mulch or straw or something like that, as opposed to pebbles. When you put an organic mulch on top, that gradually breaks down and increases the amount of organic matter that's in the soil, increases the health of the soil and the health of your plants. And as I mentioned, the more plants that are on the soil, the more carbon the soil can hold. If you're an edibles gardener and you have a raised bed or an in-ground plot that is fallow that you're not using for a season, plant it with cover crops. If you use a legume cover crop like vetch or like fava beans or bell beans, those add nitrogen to the soil for your next crop. It's important, especially for those of us who have clay soil, to improve the drainage of our soil. And one way to do that is by increasing its organic content, by adding compost. And sometimes if you really have a place in your landscape that gets very saturated and you have standing water during the winter, you may want to add drainage, to dig some French drains or do something else for drainage. You can also reroute that water to a place in your landscape where it can slowly seep in, like a bioswale or a rain garden or something like that, to keep the water on your land. And finally, some of you probably heard about low-till or no-till agriculture. And the same thing is true in home gardens. The more that we hold ourselves back from disturbing the soil structure, the healthier that soil, that biological community that lives in the soil is going to stay. And so we disturb the soil as little as possible, and really only to dig a little hole for the plant you're going to put in, but try not to disrupt the soil an awful lot. So those are the key things about improving and protecting the soil, and this will put us in good shape for increasing temperatures and protecting, keeping our plants healthy when we have to contend with both drought or extreme rainfall. Barbara, are there any questions so far?
Yes, we have two good ones, and they relate both to tillage. One is, if you want to add substances to adjust the pH or maybe add calcium, what do you recommend, since they need to get into the soil? And I guess similarly, if you're planting something like fava beans, do you cut off the tops and leave the roots in place?
Okay, good questions. I'll take the first one first. Pitchforks are really handy for opening up the soil just a little bit. If you stick in your pitchfork and just rock it back and forth just a little bit, that can help get soil amendments down into the soil. But you can, if you, I mean, it's not a horrible thing to dig something in, as long as you don't disturb the roots of whatever is growing there. I have, for example, I have some blueberries in big pot, in half barrels. And every now and then I add some sulfur to decrease the pH. And what I'll do is just stick the trowel in kind of, you know, kind of close out to the edge in several places around the edge of the pot, and just kind of work in a little soil rather than digging everything up. But if you put it in, it's going to eventually get moved throughout the soil. Some amendments like compost, you can put right on the surface and just water in. And that goes for some other minerals too. Barbara, do you have anything to add on that question?
I don't. No, that was good. And then the fava beans.
Fava beans. So actually, I've been out the last couple of days cutting down my fava bean cover crop. And the way that I do it is I use a method called chop and drop. And you cut off the plant at the base, all the stalks of one fava bean plant will send up like a half a dozen or so big stalks. Cut them all off, and I chop them up into about 6 or 8 inch chunks and just lay them right down on the soil and give them about 2-3 weeks to decompose. They serve as a mulch on the soil. And by the time I'm ready to plant my warm weather crops, my tomatoes and my squash and beans, that bed, they'll be decomposed and ready. You can also just cut them off at the base and chop them up and put them on your compost pile if you have a compost pile and you don't want to use them as mulch. You should leave the roots in the ground because the roots of any leguminous cover crop have these little nodules on them, and that's where the nitrogen fixing bacteria are living. That's where the nitrogen is. It's going to be sharing itself with the plants that you later plant. So you're going to want to leave those, the roots in the ground and kind of plant around them.
So a couple follow-ups. One is, do you cut them before or after they set flowers and beans? And related, someone said 50% bloom to chop.
Yes, exactly. About 50% bloom to chop. The nitrogen adding cover crops reach their maximum nitrogen in the roots when they're at about 50% bloom. Once they start setting beans, more of the nitrogen is going into the plant tissue. And so if you want to use their maximum impact for adding nitrogen to your soil, you'll cut them when they're about 50%. I left about 1/3 of my fava bean cover crops standing to grow beans because it just breaks my heart to, to give up all the fava beans. And so I left some of them standing, but the last couple of days I was doing chop and drop on my fava beans. So
One last
Okay.
question, and then I think we should move on. Someone has been using azomite with tomatoes and wants to know if that helps preserve carbon since it enhances microbial action.
I don't know what azomite is.
I
Do
don't
you,
either.
Barbara?
No, I don't either. I thought you would.
Yeah, no, I'm not. If it is something that is sold with the cover crop seed to enhance nitrogen fixation, sometimes you can, well, not sometimes, but you can buy treatments for your cover crop beans or seeds that increase the amount of nitrogen that they'll produce. And if azomite is that, yes, that will increase the effectiveness of your cover crop in terms of adding nitrogen. But I'm sorry, I don't know what azomite is. So You're ahead of us on that one.
Let's move on.
Okay, I'm going to move on here. So unfortunately, one of the impacts of climate change that we know all too well is that wildfire risk has impacted us more and more. And I'm just realizing, can everybody see the controls at the top of my screen, or are you seeing the whole slide?
No, just seeing the slide.
Oh, okay, good.
We're
Okay.
seeing the whole slide.
Okay, good. So wildfire risk is unfortunately a fact of life here in Northern California now, particularly in years like this when our water is low and our water is in short supply. Our soil and our fuel is going to dry out sooner with increased temperatures and decreased precipitation. So we must be fire smart in our landscapes. And that means that near the house, in the really close zone around your house, within 5 feet, it's advised that you use hardscape or ground cover that's low growing and well hydrated and not woody, that is herbaceous. From the zone of 5 to 30 feet out, we advise to keep it lean and green. That is, you're going to want to make sure there's adequate spacing between the plants, both horizontally and vertically. We don't want plants to create what's called a fire ladder, where a fire can move up from, say you've got a low woody ground cover, like, I don't know, manzanita or something like that as a ground cover, then fire can move up into the shrub above it and up from that into the tree canopy. And that's what we want to avoid. That's called a vertical fire ladder. Same thing horizontally. We want to have enough spacing between plants so that fire isn't going to continuously spread all the way to the house. And one way to handle that is to use plants in kind of islands with either pathways or hardscape or grass in between the islands of planting. Maintenance is really key, particularly with plants that create brushy waste when they're done blooming, or plants that, like woody plants, woody shrubs and trees that get messy in the middle and provide a source of ignition and continued burning. So we want to make sure that we maintain our plants that need cleanup. And we think about using the least combustible materials close to the house, especially. Really least combustible materials at all times, but closer to the house, we want to think about using either non-burnable mulch like gravel or something like that, or to be a little bit more climate smart, use, say, a wood mulch, but with large wood chips that don't have a lot of surface area to catch fire. The most combustible mulch are the really fine hairy mulches like gorilla hair. Those are really not good to have anywhere on your property that's close to structures. Okay, managing water is going to be so key to adapting to climate change. And here are some strategies for doing that. We first of all want to think about planting plants together that have similar water needs. This is called hydrozones. And so you don't want to have a plant that needs to have consistently moist soil next to, say, I don't know, a native plant that, say, like ceanothus or something like that, that want to dry out between waterings. So we'd like to have plants together that have similar water needs. That way, when you water, you're being most efficient with your water. Number two, choosing drought-resistant plants is the way to go. And we've got so many California natives and other Mediterranean plants to choose from that are already adapted to a summer dry climate. And you all know we get very little water between April 1st and September 30th. And we don't get much water usually in October. So we've got a very long dry season. And so we want to choose plants that don't need a ton of watering throughout the dry season. And when we do water them, we want to water them slowly and deeply. We want to water deeply because we want that water to get down into the roots, down to the zone of the soil where the roots are living. And for most perennial plants, that's going to be 6 to 12 inches down. For most trees and shrubs, that can be even deeper. That can be, say, 12 inches down to even 18 or sometimes 24 inches down, where the feeder roots are that take up the water. Focus your watering for trees and shrubs around the drip line of the plants. And that's the drip line is where it's the edge of where the foliage is on a plant or a tree. That's your drip line. And under that drip line is where the most feeder roots are that are looking for water and nutrients. So that's where to focus deep watering. And when you water deeply, the soil is going to hang on to that water and evaporate it less quickly than if you only water into, say, the top 3 or 4 inches of the soil. That's going to evaporate much more quickly. So watering deeply is an effective strategy for adapting to climate change. And that way also we need to water less frequently. And to top it off, that's not only an adaptation strategy to deal with a warmer and perhaps more droughty climate, but saving water also saves energy because it takes a lot of energy to produce clean water. And so every time we save water in the garden by watering more efficiently, we are also helping to mitigate climate change. Drip irrigation is the most efficient technique for watering plants because it puts, unlike, say, using a sprinkler, the water doesn't have a chance to evaporate. It really goes right onto the surface of the soil or just below the surface of the soil and soaks right in. Furthermore, I mentioned earlier compost and mulch. They help keep the soil moist underneath. If you've ever compared a part of your garden that has bare soil from a part of your garden that has mulch, just go out and see for yourself how much moisture the soil stays under a layer of mulch or a compost put on top of the soil as mulch. I mentioned before, there are ways of capturing water on your land with rain gardens and bioswales. It's also important to think about if you're putting in any hardscape, any patios or paths into your yard, to make those permeable. We don't want to have large expanses of cement or asphalt that just let the water run off and don't let the water permeate back into the soil. So we want to try to encourage keeping the water that falls on our land rather than running off. And one more way to do that is by harvesting rainwater. If you have anywhere from a few smaller barrels to a very large storage tank, you're doing your bit to help your garden be more resilient in the face of scarce resources, water in this case. Master gardeners have a program called Garden Walks. And in our Garden Walk program, we will send 2 trained master gardeners to your yard to meet with you, to walk around and talk with you about how to improve your watering, how to improve the health of your soil, and how to think about choosing climate appropriate plants. And this is a free program. It's supported by the Marin Municipal Water District. It's available to anybody who lives in Marin, and you can call our Master Gardener Help Desk at the number given here if you'd like to request a garden walk. It's a great program. Okay, I'm going to move on to plant selection. So we want to think about selecting plants that in the face of climate change are going to be appropriate into the future and help us adapt to a climate change context. So I mentioned before, our climate is summer dry, winter wet, and we want to choose plants that are going to be helpful there. I'm going to talk about each of these areas briefly. So native plants are adapted to our dry summers and wet winters. In addition, they have the additional benefit of supporting native insects and wildlife who have adapted with them. We also have the choice in our nurseries of many Mediterranean plants that can thrive in our climate. And Mediterranean plants come from the other 4 Mediterranean climate areas of the world. Number 1 being the Mediterranean basin. Number 2 being South Africa. Number 3 being the coast of South America, the western coast of South America, Chile. And the 4th being Australia. So when you see a plant that's labeled Mediterranean, handles summer dry, winter wet, that can be a plant that should be able to thrive in our Marin gardens, provided you have a microclimate that's not too unusual. We need to think about when we try to put in a succulent garden, we want to think about whether we've got frost that they need to handle and whether they can handle drought. And most succulents are really good at handling drought because they store water in their fleshy stems and leaves. However, succulents don't do too well with saturated soil. They don't like to get their feet wet. And so if you have bad drainage, you're going to want to improve your drainage and in particular, probably do quite a lot of amendment to your soil with some lava rock and some other porous material if you want to have a succulent garden. Any questions?
We do. We have questions.
Okay.
I think this is a really important one right now. Someone asked if we should water the oak trees. I mean, we're not supposed to water oak trees, but in this kind of a drought, is it time to rethink that a little bit?
If it's a really, really dry summer, my understanding is that perhaps once a month towards the middle to the end of the summer, like maybe July, August, September, you might want to do a deep watering around the drip line. Is that your understanding, Barbara?
Yes, right. String a drip line or a soaker hose would work too, way out from the tree, around the tree. Or way out from the trunk, I mean.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't want to water near the trunks of trees because that can lead to rotting out at the base of the trunk and in the roots.
Right.
Good. Shall I go on?
A couple more. We had a question about powdery mildew, but I put a link to the article I wrote on that in the chat.
Okay, great.
So if anyone else is interested in powdery mildew, they can look in the chat for that link. And for aphids, we got a couple responses to that suggesting spray the aphids off or maybe pinch them off. if you have any more aphid advice, ladybugs, I don't know.
Well, encourage beneficials into your garden by
Yeah.
planting flowering plants. And that'll bring in the beneficials. Another thing to discourage aphids, and I'm going to talk about, I'm not sure I'm going to talk about fertilizer. We discourage the use of synthetic fertilizers. They give a large burst of nutrients to the plant all at once, faster than the plants can handle it. And when you over fertilize, that promotes a lot of new growth that's very susceptible to aphids, because aphids go where the nutrients are in the plants. And so fertilizing with much more modest materials like compost and organic based materials rather than synthetic fertilizers that deliver too much nutrients to the plant is also going to help with aphids. But yeah, spray them off with a hose, or just pick on my rosebuds. I just kind of, pick them off with my fingers. It's kind of gross.
I do too.
Okay, I'm going to move on.
Yeah, please.
Talked about planting for pollinators. Our pollinators, particularly our bees and our butterflies like monarchs, are in trouble. We need to think about pollinators when we choose plants for our garden. We want to try to have a spectrum of flowering plants that are blooming continuously throughout the growing season. And if we have a landscape like this that's going to be attractive to our native pollinators, that is going to help us with our edible gardening. And it's also going to help us just to be good stewards of the environment and to create habitat within our gardens that supports the threatened ecosystems outside of our own gardens in the natural landscapes. Pollinators also like to find a whole glob, that's a technical term, a whole glob of the same kind of plants all at once. It's kind of like a one-stop shop. Instead of having to flit through, say, a 15-foot garden bed to find the asters that are blooming, if you have a big, say, a 3-foot swath of asters, those pollinators can just cruise around within that large grouping and find what they need in a very efficient way. So that's another strategy if you have room for it in your garden. Planting shrubs is really important for climate change mitigation in particular, because all plants store carbon, but trees and shrubs, the larger the plant, the more carbon they store. And trees and shrubs, of course, are going to store more than smaller plants. By choosing native trees and shrubs, we help support our native wildlife, insect wildlife, and larger wildlife. These can include fruit trees and berry bushes to help provide us with locally grown food. And the other thing we want to keep in mind when if we're choosing a plant like a tree or shrub, we want to think to the future, because most trees live for a pretty long time, and large shrubs live for a pretty long time too. And so knowing that in 10, 20, 30, 40 years, the climate's going to be warmer, we want to choose the trees and shrubs that are currently growing in the climates that look like what our climate's going to look like down the road. So for example, you might want to think about, where's a climate that's a few degrees warmer than the one that you live in right now? Whether that's, up in Sonoma, down in Monterey, it depends what kind of microclimate you live in. But think about something that's going to tolerate and thrive in conditions that are a little bit warmer than what we have today. This is one of my favorite climate change adaptation strategies is growing your own food. But it does come with the need to be aware of what climate change is doing to our edible gardens. We need to think about finding varieties of the vegetables and fruits we grow that can handle more heat, more extreme, sometimes extremes of temperature, extremes of precipitation. We're seeing less fog, and so that's another way of getting moisture to our plants. But climate change is also bringing us more generations of pests each year. And for those of you who live near the coast, whether that's the Bay Coast or the ocean coast, sea level rise combined with storm surges is bringing the threat of saltwater intrusion into our soil for those of us who are quite close to the coast. As we encounter our warming climate, those of us who are vegetable gardens are going to want to adjust our planting dates. If you remember last summer, we had a heat wave around Labor Day that I don't know what it did in your garden, but in mine, the tomatoes felt cooked. And so maybe we're going to be able to plant tomatoes earlier so that they're not at their peak harvest when the late summer hot weather arrives. You can also look for varieties that mature more quickly and that are drought tolerant. And so if I can grow a cabbage in a month less time, if I get a quick maturing variety, that saves on water and other inputs. So that's an adaptation strategy for a warmer climate. Also perennials in your garden, like asparagus and berry bushes and tree collards and artichokes and fruit trees are less thirsty than annuals, which is what most of our crops are. I talked earlier about cover crops during a fallow season, whether it's just in one raised bed like this or in a bed in the ground. This happens to be red clover from my garden. So cover crops are a good idea for edibles. One of the things that we all want to be aware of as stewards of our habitat is to eliminate invasives from our home gardens. Invasives escape out into open land and overcome native plants. They tend to compete better than native plants in the face of changing environmental conditions. And so we want to protect our native habitat by keeping the invasives out of our gardens. Lawn is an interesting question in terms of thinking about climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation. On the one hand, a lawn covers the ground with plants, and that helps store carbon. On the other hand, lawns are ecological wastelands. They are just barren of, for one thing, we don't even let them fulfill their kind of life cycle. We mow them before they set seed, but they tend to be monoscapes. They don't support habitat. And besides, caring for lawns typically takes energy, not only mowing, but many people fertilize, and lawns take a lot of water. And so what master gardeners encourage instead is, if you're going to have a lawn, if you want a lawn, say you have kids that play on the lawn, you want a little patch of lawn, reduce the size of your lawn, decrease the amount of energy intensive inputs that it's going to take, or plant a lawn substitute like a low ground cover that can be walked upon, or a turf variety that only needs mowing once a year and that needs very little additional nutrient. When you do mow the lawn, leave the clippings on the lawn. That helps fertilize the lawn. And for those of you contemplating artificial turf as a climate solution, artificial turf is not climate smart. It's plastic, and it eventually goes to the landfill, and it takes all the fossil fuel inputs that other plastics take to produce. So we encourage small lawns when you want to have a lawn, and we encourage lawn substitutes when that's appropriate for your landscape needs as a more climate-friendly solution. And of course, when taking care of our yards, we want to be carbon conscious. We want to use non-powered tools whenever possible. Electric tools, of course, are better than gas tools, particularly if you have solar panels on your roof and you're recharging those tools through the sun, or you get your 100% deep green energy from Marin from MCE, then you're charging your electric tools on the sun. But hand tools are great, and we want to choose those when we can. And I've also previously talked about choosing products that don't have fossil fuels as their basis. So rather than fossil fuel-based synthetic fertilizers, choose organic soil amendments. And instead of using synthetic pesticides, use more conservative ways of dealing with pests in your garden. There's lots of advice on dealing with pests on the Master Gardener website, which I'm going to show later. Finally, in terms of in terms of climate change adaptation strategies, we want to utilize our plant and food waste in a way that is good for the environment, that's friendly to nature. As I mentioned, leave grass clippings in place, keep your leaves and other mulching materials on your property if you can, if you have room for a compost pile. Chop them up and use them as mulch. In addition, you can compost your kitchen waste and your other waste from your yard, except for weeds that have seeds, unless your compost pile gets super hot. Utilize your green bin. We're trying to avoid at any cost having plant material and kitchen waste go into the landfill. So they do not go in your regular garbage, because when they go to the landfill, they decompose without oxygen and they emit methane, which is a super powerful greenhouse gas. So we want all green waste in the green bin if you don't compost it on your own land. Plus, it gives you a wonderful material to put on your garden as mulch or compost. Okay. I think it probably goes without saying to a crowd of gardeners in Marin that we want to recycle material whenever we can. We're a pretty green community here, and I think the awareness of using materials and giving them a second life it comes naturally to most of us. But you might not have thought about propagating your own plants as a way of recycling. It means that there's not the need for a nursery to grow your plants in plastic containers and transport them all the way from wherever they're grown to the nursery you buy them in. So propagation is another recycling strategy in addition to repurposing materials. Finally, just like I started with assessing your baseline, I want to kind of end with monitoring your garden. If you observe your garden on a regular basis, you will be in touch with the changes that are happening in it, whether that's a pest that you need to deal with, whether it's a plant that's wilting because we have these windy spring and summer afternoons, or whether it's a problem of a plant getting yellow, maybe because it has too much water or because it doesn't have enough nutrients. If you observe your garden and become aware of what's going on so that you'll see the changes, it helps you monitor the health of your plants and be aware of things that you're going to need to find out about and address as you adapt to the environmental changes that come with a changing climate. So these were the climate change adaptation strategies that we focused on, just as a wrap up. And I want to say one more thing about climate smart gardening. And that is that it goes hand in hand with the practices the best practices that we know are earth friendly. As an earth friendly gardener, we want to protect natural resources and boost the habitat, the biodiversity of our beautiful landscape, including how home gardens can contribute to our beautiful natural landscape. We want to do this in a sustainable way while minimizing waste and minimizing environmental pollutants. And so these best practices that I just talked about are really also the foundation of earth-friendly gardening practices. Nurturing the soil, we talked about as foundational to coping with climate change. We talked about choosing plants in order to encourage biodiversity. We talked about conserving water and energy, reducing waste, and the way that plants store carbon. And those are all climate change mitigation strategies. And finally, we talked about protecting the environment and protecting the wildlife that lives in it by creating habitat, avoiding putting toxic chemicals into our landscapes. And so if you, whether it's climate change you're motivated by, or whether it's broader kind of sustainability and earth-friendly practices that you're strongly motivated by, all of those are really one and the same. They're the same collection of practices that will provide us with healthy and pleasing home landscapes into the future. I just want to briefly put these resources these references, in case you're curious to know more about where some of this data came from, and some local resources. And I understand that Sariana is going to send out this slide with her follow-up email, and that she's also going to send out this slide, which tells you how you can get in touch with Marin Master Gardeners for help at our help desk, subscription to our free electronic newsletter, or request a garden walk, a visit to your home by Master Gardeners. And with that, I'm going to give the floor back to Sariana, and Barbara and I will take more questions if you have them.